There comes a moment in many relationships with an avoidantly attached person when confusion starts to take over. You begin questioning every interaction, every conversation, every decision you made along the way. You wonder if you said the wrong thing, asked for too much, or revealed too much of your feelings. Your mind searches endlessly for an explanation, trying to identify the exact point where everything changed. But there is an important reality that many people struggle to understand. When an avoidant reaches a certain internal breaking point, their withdrawal is often no longer about anything you did. At that stage, the process is being driven by deeply rooted protective patterns that have existed for years, sometimes decades. These defenses become so automatic that they can overpower reason, compassion, and even genuine feelings for another person. Today, we're focusing on that critical turning point, the sign that often signals an avoidant has emotionally checked out completely. The behavior that can indicate they have no intention of returning, reconnecting, or rebuilding what once existed. And if you find yourself facing this situation, the most important thing to remember is this: don't spend endless months waiting for a different outcome. Don't exhaust yourself chasing someone who is determined to create distance. And above all, don't automatically assume that their disappearance is proof that you weren't enough. To understand why this happens, we need to look at the foundation of avoidant attachment itself. Avoidant individuals are not naturally detached people. They didn't enter the world wanting distance from others. Their emotional habits were developed as adaptations, usually in environments where vulnerability felt uncomfortable, unrewarded, or even unsafe. At some point, whether consciously or unconsciously, they learned that relying on others carried risks. They discovered that self-sufficiency felt safer than dependence. Over time, emotional independence became more than a coping strategy. It became part of their identity. This creates an internal contradiction that many people fail to recognize. Despite their distance, avoidants often want connection. They can desire love, companionship, intimacy, and emotional closeness just like anyone else. The problem is that the deeper the connection becomes, the more it activates fears they have spent years trying to manage. Because genuine intimacy asks for things that challenge their protective system. It asks for openness. It asks for emotional exposure. It asks for trust. It asks for the willingness to depend on another person and allow another person to depend on them. For someone with strong avoidant tendencies, these experiences can feel surprisingly threatening. As a result, when they encounter a relationship that starts touching deeper emotional layers, their nervous system often interprets that closeness as danger rather than safety. The stronger the bond becomes, the more conflicted they may feel. Part of them wants the connection. Another part wants to escape from it. And that internal struggle can create behaviors that seem confusing, contradictory, and painful to the person on the receiving end. In the beginning, the signs are usually subtle. Maybe their messages become less frequent. Conversations start feeling shorter and less engaged. The warmth that once came naturally begins to fade. You notice less curiosity, less emotional presence, and less effort overall. Sometimes there is no dramatic argument or obvious conflict. Instead, the connection slowly loses momentum. The person who once seemed invested starts pulling away, inch by inch. Naturally, most partners respond by trying to understand what's happening. They ask questions, they seek reassurance, they express concern, they attempt to reconnect. Unfortunately, this is often where the cycle becomes even more difficult. What feels like a reasonable attempt to restore closeness can feel overwhelming to an avoidant who is already struggling with emotional pressure. The more distance they create, the more their partner reaches out. The more their partner reaches out, the more trapped they begin to feel. And the more trapped they feel, the more distance they seek. It becomes a self-reinforcing loop. What started as uncertainty gradually turns into withdrawal. What started as withdrawal gradually turns into detachment, and eventually, in some cases, they reach a point where they stop viewing the relationship as something to manage and start viewing it as something to escape. That is the moment people often miss. Because many assume that an avoidant who leaves is still processing, still reflecting, or still trying to figure things out. Sometimes that's true, But there is another scenario that looks very different. A scenario where the avoidant doesn't merely create temporary distance. They begin systematically disconnecting themselves from the emotional bond altogether. They stop engaging with shared memories. They stop responding to attempts at repair. They stop leaving doors open for future conversations. Instead of creating space, they start erasing emotional access. This is the distinction that matters. An avoidant who is overwhelmed often retreats, but leaves some thread of connection intact. An avoidant who has crossed a deeper psychological threshold begins severing those threads one by one. Their goal is no longer regulation. Their goal becomes complete emotional disengagement. And when that process is fully underway, chasing rarely helps. Explaining more rarely helps. Loving harder rarely helps. Because the issue is no longer a lack of understanding. It's a decision made within their protective system that distance feels safer than connection. When that decision becomes permanent in their mind, the emotional door doesn't simply close, it locks. And once that happens, continuing to wait for them to return often causes more pain than healing. The hardest truth is that sometimes the healthiest response is accepting what their actions are already communicating. Not because you didn't care enough, not because you failed, but because some people become so committed to emotional self-protection that they walk away from connections they once genuinely valued. And when that happens, your energy is better spent rebuilding yourself than standing outside a door that has already been shut. The moment an avoidant truly reaches the end of the road rarely looks the way most people expect. It usually isn't marked by a dramatic confrontation, an emotional goodbye, or some explosive ending. In fact, it's often the opposite. The shift is quiet, subtle, and emotionally distant. What happens is something far more significant than simply pulling away. They begin removing you from their emotional reality. Instead of processing the relationship in a balanced way, they unconsciously reconstruct the story to support their need for distance. The history of the connection starts to change inside their mind. Events become reinterpreted. Moments are viewed through a different lens. The relationship is no longer remembered as something meaningful that became complicated. Instead, it becomes a source of pressure, discomfort, or emotional burden. In this revised version of the story, you gradually become the reason things failed. You were too demanding, too emotional, too dependent, too much. And what makes this confusing is that these labels often appear regardless of how you actually behaved. You may have been patient. You may have communicated respectfully. You may have given them space, supported them, and tried your best to understand their struggles. Yet the narrative still shifts. If you begin hearing that they're describing you in ways that don't resemble the reality of the relationship, pay attention. Maybe mutual friends mention comments that feel strangely exaggerated. Maybe you've been characterized as toxic, dramatic, controlling, or obsessed, despite never displaying those traits in any meaningful way. When this begins happening, it often signals something deeper than ordinary distancing. It suggests that the avoidant is psychologically creating a version of events that allows them to feel comfortable with leaving. This is not necessarily a conscious act of deception. In many cases, it's a protective process happening beneath awareness. The human mind dislikes internal conflict. It dislikes guilt. And for avoidants, guilt can be particularly uncomfortable because it forces them to confront emotional responsibility, vulnerability, and the impact of their actions on another person. Rather than sitting with those feelings, they may unconsciously seek relief by emphasizing your mistakes while minimizing the value of the connection itself. The positive memories become smaller, the problems become larger, the bond becomes less important, your flaws become more important. This mental restructuring creates emotional permission to walk away, and once this process gains momentum, it is surprisingly difficult to reverse. Because returning would require more than reaching out. It would require questioning the story they've been telling themselves. It would require acknowledging that the situation may have been more complex than they allowed themselves to believe. It would require admitting that someone they painted as the problem may not have been the problem at all. For many avoidants, that level of self-examination feels deeply uncomfortable. It pulls them toward vulnerability. It challenges their defenses, and it forces them closer to fears they've spent years avoiding. That is why the emotional rewrite can become so powerful. It protects them not only from the relationship, but from the difficult emotions associated with ending it. There is another sign that is equally painful to witness. It's not anger, it's not sadness, it's not visible heartbreak, it's relief. One of the clearest indicators that an avoidant has emotionally disconnected is the sense of freedom they experience after cutting contact. At least on the surface, they appear lighter, more relaxed, less burdened. The relationship is no longer activating the emotional pressures that once made them uncomfortable, so their nervous system temporarily experiences distance as relief. You often see this reflected in their behavior. They don't check on you. They don't look for reasons to reconnect. They don't send casual messages to keep the door open. And they don't reach out simply because they miss your presence. In many cases, communication stops entirely. If they do respond, their messages feel strangely different. The emotional warmth that once existed is gone. The replies become brief, functional, detached, almost as if they're speaking to an acquaintance rather than someone who once meant a great deal to them. The contrast can feel shocking. You remember the affection. You remember the vulnerability. You remember the moments when they seemed emotionally invested. But now their communication feels distant and impersonal, as though a switch has been flipped. What you're often witnessing is not the absence of all feeling. It's the result of powerful emotional defenses taking control. The avoidant has mentally sealed off the relationship and surrounded that decision with layers of justification. Every rationalization reinforces the distance. Every explanation strengthens the emotional barrier. Every rewritten memory makes it easier to stay away. In a sense, they haven't simply left the relationship. They've created psychological insulation from it. By numbing themselves to the emotional significance of what existed, they reduce the discomfort that would otherwise accompany their decision. This emotional shutdown allows them to move forward without fully confronting the guilt, grief, or vulnerability that reconnecting might require. And when someone reaches that stage, the issue is no longer a lack of communication or understanding. The issue is that they've convinced themselves that staying away is the safest option. Once that belief becomes deeply rooted, the distance is no longer temporary. It becomes part of the story they've chosen to live by. Someone who appears completely at peace while systematically removing you from their life is usually not preparing for a return. That reality is painful, especially when you're still carrying the weight of the loss. You might open social media and see them smiling in photos, spending time with friends, going out, traveling, or seemingly enjoying life without a second thought. Naturally, this creates a painful question. How can they look so unaffected when you're still trying to make sense of what happened? The answer is often misunderstood. Avoidant individuals don't necessarily process emotional pain the way others do. Rather than moving directly through grief, they frequently move around it. They postpone it, they suppress it, they distract themselves from it. Instead of sitting with difficult emotions, they create distance from the feelings themselves. Ironically, the relationships that affect them most are often the ones they work hardest to disconnect from. The deeper the attachment, the stronger the urge to escape the vulnerability that comes with it. The more meaningful the connection becomes, the greater the temptation to minimize its importance once it ends. This is why some avoidants behave as though a significant relationship barely mattered at all. They act as if they've moved on overnight. They present an image of certainty, confidence, and emotional freedom. But appearing unaffected is not the same thing as healing. Emotional avoidance and emotional recovery are two very different processes. One involves facing pain. The other involves running from it. So if an avoidant seems unusually detached immediately after a breakup, don't automatically interpret that as evidence that they've reached some higher level of clarity or emotional maturity. Often, what you're witnessing is a protective shutdown, a defensive response designed to create distance from uncomfortable feelings before those feelings have a chance to surface. And in some cases, that shutdown becomes so deeply reinforced that they never fully revisit what happened. That said, it's important to recognize that not every avoidant follows the same path. Some eventually reflect on their behavior. Some begin questioning the stories they've told themselves. Some experience regret, gain self-awareness, and become willing to examine their role in the relationship. Growth is possible. People can change. They can develop healthier emotional habits. They can learn to tolerate vulnerability rather than fear it. But meaningful change usually requires intention. It requires self-examination. It requires accountability. For many people, it requires therapy, emotional education, or a genuine commitment to understanding themselves. Without that effort, old patterns tend to repeat themselves. And this is where an important distinction emerges. If an avoidant demonstrates remorse, curiosity, or a willingness to reflect on what happened, there is at least evidence that they're engaging with the experience honestly. But if there is no reflection whatsoever, no acknowledgement of their contribution to the breakdown, no willingness to explore their own behavior, no empathy for the impact their actions had on you, then the situation looks very different, especially if they behave as though you never mattered, or worse, if they cast you as the sole problem in a story that was always more complicated than that. At that point, they are no longer simply protecting themselves from emotional discomfort. They are dismantling the bridge that once connected the two of you. And rebuilding a bridge becomes nearly impossible when one person is actively convincing themselves that it never deserved to exist in the first place. One of the hardest realities about strong avoidant defenses is how thoroughly they can disconnect when they decide a relationship is over. The separation often extends beyond physical distance. It becomes mental, emotional, psychological. They may remove reminders of you from their environment. Photos disappear, messages get deleted, connections on social media are removed. Sometimes they block contact altogether. To the person being left behind, these actions can feel harsh or unnecessarily cold. But from the avoidance perspective, the motivation is often less about punishment and more about escape. Holding conflicting emotions is difficult for them. They struggle with the tension of simultaneously loving someone and feeling overwhelmed by them. They struggle with carrying affection alongside discomfort. Rather than tolerating both realities at once, they often simplify the situation. The reminders go away. The memories get pushed aside. The connection becomes easier to compartmentalize. Out of sight becomes out of mind. And once that process begins, emotional repair becomes increasingly unlikely. Because the goal is no longer understanding, the goal is relief. The goal is creating enough distance that uncomfortable feelings no longer demand attention. In essence, they've chosen self-protection over reconciliation. Perhaps the most difficult part is that they rarely explain any of this. There is often no meaningful conversation, no detailed discussion, no emotional unpacking of what happened, no satisfying sense of closure. Instead, you're left alone with unanswered questions. You replay conversations. You search for hidden meanings. You analyze every interaction. You wonder whether there was something you missed. But silence itself is often part of the pattern. Avoidants tend to view emotionally intense discussions as overwhelming. Confrontation feels threatening. Deep emotional processing feels exhausting. Many would rather disappear than engage in a conversation that requires them to sit face-to-face with vulnerability. And unfortunately, the harder someone pushes for answers, the more justified the avoidant may feel in maintaining their distance. Every request for closure can be interpreted through their defensive lens as pressure. Every attempt to understand can be viewed as emotional demand, which only reinforces the story they've already created. So if you've been met with complete silence, emotional coldness, or a version of events that barely resembles reality, and especially if they've rewritten your role in their life beyond recognition, understand what that often means. At that stage, they usually aren't debating whether they should return. They've already committed themselves to the decision to stay away. In reality, the departure happened long before the physical separation. By the time you notice the silence, the distance, or the indifference, they had often already disconnected internally. So, what should you do when you recognize these signs? You stop waiting for a different ending. You stop searching for hidden meanings in every action, every social media post, every delayed response. You stop exhausting yourself trying to understand someone who has already chosen distance over connection. Most importantly, you stop making your emotional well-being dependent on a person who never developed the ability to remain present when relationships became emotionally demanding. Instead, you begin reclaiming your own story. You remind yourself that another person's inability to receive love does not diminish the value of the love you offered. You recognize that someone's fear of intimacy is not evidence that you were unworthy of intimacy. You stop treating their withdrawal as a measurement of your value, because it never was. One of the greatest mistakes people make after losing an avoidant partner is turning the experience into a verdict about themselves. They assume they weren't attractive enough, patient enough, understanding enough, important enough. But attachment wounds don't work that way. Someone can genuinely care about you and still be unable to sustain the closeness that healthy relationships require. Their limitations belong to them. They are not proof of yours. The real healing begins when you stop organizing your life around the possibility of their return. When your plans, your happiness, and your future no longer depend on whether they eventually reach out. When you stop waiting for closure from the person who created the wound and start creating closure for yourself. Because the truth is simple. It is not your responsibility to rescue an avoidant from their own defenses. It is not your responsibility to convince someone that you are safe to love. It is not your responsibility to continuously prove your worth to a person who keeps questioning it. Healthy love does not require endless persuasion. The right partner doesn't need to be convinced to stay connected. They move toward difficult conversations instead of running from them. They communicate when problems arise instead of disappearing. They face discomfort together rather than treating distance as the solution to every emotional challenge. If the avoidant in your life has repeatedly chosen silence, blame, emotional withdrawal, and disconnection, then their actions have already provided the answer you've been seeking. They're not simply confused. They're not temporarily distracted. They're not too busy to care. They've made a choice, and continuing to cling to their absence only prolongs your suffering. There is another reality that catches many people off guard. Sometimes avoidants do reappear. Not always, but often enough to create confusion. They may reach out months later. They may send a casual message. They may suddenly become curious about what you're doing and whether you've moved on. But contact alone should never be mistaken for transformation. Reaching out is not the same thing as growth. Missing someone is not the same thing as changing. And curiosity is not the same thing as commitment. If they return without having done the difficult internal work required to understand their patterns, the relationship usually follows the same familiar path. The connection rebuilds, closeness increases, fear gets activated, distance returns. Then comes withdrawal, defensiveness, blame, or silence. The cycle repeats because the underlying issues remain untouched. That's why temporary reappearances should be evaluated carefully, not by what they say, but by who they have become. Have they developed self-awareness? Can they take responsibility for their actions? Do they acknowledge the hurt they caused? Have they learned healthier ways to handle intimacy and vulnerability? Without those changes, history tends to repeat itself. And if someone completely erased your significance, rewrote the relationship to justify leaving, projected all responsibility onto you, and walked away without accountability, then any future return is unlikely to offer the connection you once hoped for. Because meaningful reconciliation requires honesty. It requires ownership. It requires growth. Without those things, a return is simply another chapter of the same story. Sometimes people come back because they feel lonely. Sometimes because they miss the comfort you provided. Sometimes because they notice you've stopped chasing them and their curiosity is triggered. But none of those reasons automatically reflect genuine love. The most important shift happens when you stop focusing on whether they will return and start focusing on whether returning would actually be good for you. That question changes everything, because your healing was never supposed to depend on their decision. Your healing begins when you choose yourself. When you allow their silence to become information instead of an invitation to chase. When you allow the empty space they left behind to become a place of growth rather than a place of waiting. Let that silence teach you what their words never did. Let it create room for peace. Let it become the foundation upon which you rebuild your confidence, your identity, and your future. Because once someone reaches the point of rewriting the relationship, disconnecting from the emotional bond, and convincing themselves that distance is preferable to accountability, the solution is no longer found in your love. The solution lies in whether they choose to confront themselves, and many never do. Many spend years repeating the same protective patterns, years avoiding vulnerability, years keeping people at arm's length, years choosing emotional safety over emotional intimacy. That is their journey to face, not yours. Your responsibility is not to save them. Your responsibility is to protect your own peace, to release what no longer serves you, to stop waiting at a closed door, and to move forward toward relationships where love is met with presence instead of escape. Because you deserve someone who doesn't retreat when the connection becomes real. You deserve someone who stays.